part of the beauty of this system that you're suggesting is this federalist thing where it's like, if you want to do crazy things over there, do it. It's fine. You want to practice your things that will never work, do it over there, away from this protected space.
What happens is they migrate to good places and then justify their bad behaviors. That's why you have to have it written down, because norms aren't enough. You got to have it written down, because written down stuff, when it's law, it lasts. There are unfortunately those who will always favor escape, deceit, self-deceit, and deceit of others. But our job is to minimize those people. And those people are largely what we call margin. And if necessary, as Hoppe says, physical removal may be necessary, which means there will always be cities that collect dysfunctionals. And dysfunctionals can have their own little problems, which is what we see happening as the destruction of America one city at a time by accumulating these people there. And you always have elites that enjoy benefiting from ruling those dysfunctionals, feeding their false promise in exchange for their evasion of responsibility and offshoring responsibility to the elites who take care of them. So you will have cities which produce permanent childhood for dysfunctionals, permanent parenting and permanent childhood, and you will have the towns, I'm going to separate cities from towns, right, towns and counties that will produce equality in parenting and responsibility. The only time we've actually been united is the Second World War. And we had this after effect after the Second World War. But I mean, the country's always been on the verge of breaking up. What we've forgotten is the reason we didn't is because we were afraid that if we broke up, we'd be recaptured by Europe. Back then, Europe was the bully of the world, like the world considers America the bully of the world. We were just trying to preserve our security and our sovereignty. But at this point, what's happened is that threat's gone away, and the utility of being an empire instead of a federation has vanished. And we can either have another civil war over it, or we can break up. Well, the Civil War should never have happened. I'm sorry, it shouldn't have.
I know.
Slavery would have been dead within 30 years anyway. You killed 500,000 people and created a domestic empire, ruining the American project because you're fucking impulsive. So those people will want to have their own polities, and they should do that. That's what cities are for. Cities are people who want to evade responsibility, have the lowest opportunity cost, and achieve the most proportionality in perception because they are equal in their irresponsibility. That's what they're getting. Equality and irresponsibility.
It's just a trade.
It's just a trade. And so if you want to go live that way, that's fine. You're going to suffer for it. The way you will suffer is that you will have the need for authority to resolve differences because of your differences in evasion of responsibility. So that's what you will have, is these shithole cities that are universal to every civilization except a few Northern Europeans. So what we want to do is continue the exceptional European system of maximizing responsibility, maximizing agency, and minimizing those of you who are irresponsible. The thing is that there are people who fall into that because it's just cheaper. There are people in the middle, the ambivalent people, that are happy to take on responsibility. They just don't want to get involved in the nonsense. That's the majority middle. So that's fine. You'll end up with what we see as shithole cities, with the irresponsible incompetents at the bottom and a few responsible competents at the top who profit from managing the herd. Okay, fine. That's great. You keep the undomesticated animals, we'll keep the domesticated animals. It works both ways. We don't have to be the same. We just can't live together.
The issue is to create the federal system that allows it to cooperate within the greater framework. That's all. We
need defense and credit capacity and insurance capacity. That's it. Defense, credit, and insurance. You have to have credit in order to have insurance. You need to have defense in order to have credit and insurance. That's all you need. You need a judiciary to resolve differences in property between the two. In other words, there's always going to be interstate trade. There need to be disputes resolved over interstate trade. But in any interstate trade, you're always solving only by reciprocity. It's only within states you vary in proportionality. So the only question is, you want to do the hard work of policing and disciplining all these people and forcibly removing whatever you want, however you want to call it, imprisoning, ostracizing, or literally shipping abroad those people who are criminals? Or do you want to police them? Or do you want to separate from them?
The most cost-effective manner appears to me to be free cities.
Free cities and wall them in.
Dig a moat, right?
Yeah.
It's okay.
What's going to happen, of course, is the quality of life outside the left cities will radically increase. The quality of life inside them will radically decrease. The good people will move, and they will move into an environment with a higher standard and of living and a zero tolerance policy for crime, which is maybe their intuition, but is wrong. So they'll move. And so that's my view. You want to get the boys together and, just take the whole enchilada. I mean, I guess that's fine. I just think that's a lot of work.
It's excessive roughness, and it's like, what advantages to be gained?
Yeah, you want them out of the gene pool.
I think that they will use their own volition to segregate to where they would think they prefer to be.
Right. And you'll get all these crazy chicks, the crazy ones, they'll go there until they realize that the cost of adaptation for the higher quality of life is worth it. So we'll achieve in, a couple of decades, because that's usually what it takes, about 20 years.
Yep.
We'll achieve in a couple of decades what we want to achieve without having to have a whole lot of skull pyramids.
Skull pyramid covers it. It's like,
I was going to say conflict, bloodshed, harm.
Skull pyramid is right, though.
Skull pyramid.
That's perfect. This distributed federalist construction. We're trying to create the matrix within which a wide variety of ideological perspectives can fit together in a cooperative manner. It's a organized, larger group to defend the interests of the smaller groups. And in that, every individual fits into some smaller group. And it's like this, it's unification of the right, which is sadly lacking and has been.
That's what's necessary for these different factions to both explore their maximum opportunities, yet unite in defense. It's the only way of creating a market for factions. Because just like there's a value in the sexes being different, there's value in the factions being different. Because each faction seeks evolutionary advantage. And so by letting each faction maximize, it's not like the Chinese state or the Muslim religion. We let every faction maximize its attempt within the limits of loyalty. And loyalty just means loyalty to preserve the ability to do so without imposing costs upon others. So our system is based as a universal military, all of which are do our duty in loyalty, despite the fact that we operate as factions or clans or tribes or sexes or classes within that system of loyalty and sovereignty and reciprocity. And so, sure, if a bunch of fundamentalists want to get together, great. If a bunch of National Socialists want together, great. If a bunch of civ-nats want to get together, great. If a bunch of Catholics want to get together, great. Those are all good things under the Federalist model, because the Federalist model only requires we ensure one another's choice to produce those different polities. That's all we're doing. We're ensuring one another's choice and preventing one another from parasitism upon one another, so that we all can advance, achieve the maximum returns on our biases and preferences that are possible without engaging in parasitism. Can we make conservatives understand that? I don't know.
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge. What we probably can do is make enough leadership understand it, that the people do what conservatives naturally do, which is follow personalities. And so we have to find enough people with enough personalities who are willing to provide leadership for the group as part of a whole, rather than obtain clicks and kickbacks and emotional rewards for monopolizing and dividing people along their factions. So we need to find factional heads that are unifiers rather than dividers. The purpose of a state is to produce commons. The purpose of a federation is to produce defense of the state's differences in producing commons. You avoid this problem of everybody should do it the fascist way. Everybody should do it the communist way. everybody should do the anarchist way.
I call this it's the universalist problem. A one size fits all answer is not going to work. And that's not what we're after here.
What we need people to understand is federations are just markets for polities. The way polities create markets for commons, the way commons create markets for the production of goods and services, and the proceeds of which can be produced for redistributions. This is a market system that maximizes evolutionary computation without hurting anyone else. So the Holy Roman Empire, hundreds of Germanic princedoms, hundreds, all of which competing to produce excellences, which is why there's such a German miracle and why the greater unification of a state only facilitates war, like the French. I wanted to forego a particular fallacy, which is, I'm not doing this because we've done it before. In other words, I'm not looking back into history and saying, well, history worked. I'm saying that there's a pattern of the evolution of European civilization over thousands of years. And that pattern progresses in a consistent evolutionary direction toward the maximization of adaptive calculation. And we do so by the principles of reciprocal insurance of sovereignty. And we do that by ensuring reciprocity and display word and deed at the cost of duty and truth. Truth before face and duty.
The second thing I tell the men is know who your friends are.
Your friends are anyone who will give you loyalty to the production of not the commons you want, but the freedom to create commons you do want.
Like you want.
For me, I'm loyal to fundamentalist Christians. I would enjoy living them. I don't want them to govern, but if they want to govern themselves, fine. You know what will happen? When we create all these things, the good will emerge and the bad will be cast off, and then we'll reconverge. Meanwhile, the left, once no longer able to undermine, they'll collapse because all the bad people will go there. They'll have the bottom and the top authoritarians. They will essentially create states that function like the church for the dysfunctional. And frankly, that is the best way of doing it, is separating them into their own polities. If you move those people into their own areas, you will have what we see in South America, a poorer population that can blame the upper class, yet take mindfulness by blaming the upper class, therefore evading responsibility, while the upper class lives a very nice life in city centers, providing all those people with justification for their unity in irresponsibility. They'll produce sustainable polities that will shell out people who want to achieve, and we will shell out people who want to evade responsibility. And that provides the polities necessary. But it also saves us 5,000 years or 10,000 years of genetic evolution, because we don't have to get those people out of the gene pool by not reproducing. We just have to let them move out. That's why you see IQ increasing as they move out of radius from Africa and South Eurasia. IQ increases because smart people leave, because they can obtain opportunity. And this is really all Nietzsche is really trying to say. Smart, heroic, inventive, adaptive, creative people can't be bound by norms that have been built to provide stability for unsmart, uncreative people, unadaptive people. Well, we just provide vehicles for sortition. You know, you saw in the Germanic polities how desperately and respectfully monarchies competed for top craftsmen and artists. That's what we want to produce.
The trick is you're not going to convince the other conservatives that don't agree with your particular bent or bias in conservatism to be like you, because this guy's a monarchist. He's not going to do it. And he's going to do what he does, and you're not going to agree. And then the lefties will keep on driving Cthulhu to the left.
In this sense, loyalty is all that matters.
That's right.
You need to have loyalty. I am loyal to the extremes. I'm willing to be loyal to the fundamentalists, to the Catholics, to the ethno-nationalists, to the National Socialists, the civic nationalists, the libertarians. I'm happy to be loyal to all those people in pursuit of each group's ability to produce a polity according to his or her wants and needs. We have a big country. We've already begun to sort into those polities. So let's just formalize the arrangement. The Northeast will turn into Northern Brazil or Argentina. The Southwest will turn into Bolivia. And fine, the Germanic part of the center. And honestly, I think the blacks will join us because, I know there's a whole thing about black, but it's not like they aren't screwed. To complain about black people is to say, well, you're denying the fact that they're screwed and they should take it. I'm like, help them, right? You think that because the East Coast and West Coast are Jewish states now. You think the blacks are going to be helped by them? They'll just keep playing them forever. Once the whites are gone, who are the blacks going to be played against? They're going to be screwed. And so I have perfect faith in the black community, believe it or not. Can we cohabitate together? I don't know. We can certainly federate together.
Certainly.
And the reason we can't cooperate together is because the normative demands in a black community that matures earlier are different for the normative demands of producing families in white communities mature slower. It's not all that complicated. They police each other just fine, but they can't tolerate our degree of policing in proximity, it seems, or at least their underclass can. So I just look at it as let's solve everybody's problem and let everybody have what they want. Yes, the left will have captured some sort of the territory, but they'll pay for it. Our intellectual tradition requires a military aristocracy to demand loyalty of factions that otherwise have disparate interests in producing commons. So we just have to restore the military aristocracy, in other words, the federal state. We have to do our duty in the service of the state, and then we have to produce commons. Let's look at Iceland, which is the smallest, obviously self-sustaining state, which is 300,000 people. It's 300,000 people. It doesn't make for a good-sized city. It's a country. Now, it's really a protectorate, but it's a country. What's your power distance among 300,000 people?
Short.
So what's your real ability to influence culture, norms, traditions, values, economy, and polity? And 300,000 people, you can literally talk to 1/3% of them, right? It's not difficult, right? And so this is the reason small is beautiful, is power distance. This creates a sense of security by unity. You have to produce a sense of security by unity. What people want is this is why people want scale. They want big countries because they want security despite disunity. But security despite disunity creates a government that is authoritarian in which you have infinite power distance. Do you feel like you have juridical defense? Do you feel like you have the right to petition your government for redress of grievances? Do you feel like you have the ability to sue the state for correction of grievances if you can't petition the government for redress of grievances? Do you feel that you can defend your country against immigration, invasion, war, economic war, war by conversion, war by deceit, war by financialism? No, you don't have any of those defenses. What you might have is military defense. That's all you get. You get military defense with scale, and you get the credit expansion necessary for military defense at scale. That's the only value of scale. So just separate scale, military, from everything else. You get a federation. Now you produce all the small scale goods, which are polities and norms and traditions and values, commons and consumption. And then you're not even creating this enormous thing where you've got to compete against each other in the market for goods and services. In a federation, you still can cooperate by trade, production of goods, services, information, despite the fact that you produce different commons. So if I want to have my little socialist utopia that eventually will grind to a halt and produce no innovation and adaptation whatsoever, I still get all the benefits of the people in the federation who are radical libertarians who simply want to compete by innovation. So I can get all the benefits of them like we do in the world trade. But I can equally defend my ability of sovereignty and their ability for sovereignty by having a universal military. And I still can eliminate conflicts of parasitism between states by the use of a federal judiciary. But that judiciary only has disputes over disputes between states. not over internal states. It's not a soundbite. The way you organize a federal system, you have to understand every one of these dimensions, how they intermix. That's why everybody wants, I want a church, or I want a fascist, or I want a communist, or I want a socialist. They want an authoritarian thing that they only have to understand one, rather than a model where they have to understand how it works. So it's sort of like anybody below 105 can't fix a machine because they can't systematize the machine. I'm sort of in the camp of this is the fundamental problem, is a limit of the ability to perform system thinking, pushes a limit of the ability to form a systemic government polity, which means that you have to have a majority middle class demographic in order to be able to produce a systematic rather than authoritarian polity. That's my primary concern, is if you give people the choice of participatory government, what happens if they can't simulate, if they can't model, if they can't work with systems thinking? We know women can't work with systems thinking. It's genetic and they're designed that way. But even for men, you get these men in there, and unless they're totally taught it like they're taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, they may not be able to understand systems thinking the way they may not be able to understand machines or women videotape players. It may not be able to conceive of it. So this is what I'm worried about. My fundamental problem of democracy isn't that the people won't do good things and throw the bums out. This fundamental problem is they want to understand something in one-dimensional terms, which is like saying you're an ape, versus multidimensional terms, which is the criteria for being human. Well, if you want a human government, produces human ends, you're going to have to systematize, because all this demand for authority is just confession that you can't. That's what it means. Whenever you want the Catholic Church, whenever you want fundamentalism, whenever you want communism, socialism, fascism, whenever you want those things, it's an admission that you can't systematize. It's a mission that you're unfit for having an opinion about rule. When the whole point of having an opinion about rule, especially if you want to not fall into regression or decline, is that you need to be able to conduct systemic thought. And systemic thought doesn't come across in a soundbite. Now, you're right to say, it's a federalist system, a distributed federalist system, or as Eli says, this is the humorous version, it's a distributed dictatorship of every single man. And he's right. Taking it to the hyperbolic extreme, self-determination by sovereignty, reciprocity, truth, duty, markets, and everything. Well, that's just every man is his own dictator. Okay, well, now how do we produce a government where every man is his own dictator? Well, you produce a federation. But what have we just explained? We've just explained Western civilization is different from all other civilizations. We've explained why trifunctionalism emerged, because every man is his own dictator. Why? Because you can't get a bunch of guys on a pirate ship unless they are. You can't get a bunch of guys on a yurt with carts raiding cattle unless they are. You can't get people to colonize the West unless they are. You can't get men to go into an age of sail and colonize the world unless they are. You can't get men to go out and create entrepreneurial risks unless they are. It's all distributed dictatorship, the facilitation of distributed dictatorship over the only dictator that you have power, yourself. I view secession as an opportunity, like our ancestors view the foundation of America and the creation of a middle-class society full of virtuous people as an opportunity. Just as they viewed it as an opportunity to leave the immoral peasantry, the immoral church, and the immoral state behind, I view it as our opportunity to leave behind the immoral New York, immoral Los Angeles, immoral San Francisco, immoral Portland, immoral Miami, whatever. I view it as an opportunity to leave behind the immorals, the immortal people, and save ourselves 5,000 years of social, political, economic, and genetic evolution. Because really, those people sort that way because they're either suckers or they're indoctrinated or they have the wrong instincts. And we can tell when they have the wrong instincts when you're an adult and you're practicing female infantilization under the pretense that you're producing care. Or if you're an adult and you're trying to produce monopoly and equality instead of reciprocity with the limits of proportionality. If you're trying to produce incentive to discover, compete, and produce in evolutionary computation, or you're trying to cause dysgeny and devolution. We can tell by listening to people for basically 2 minutes which kind of person they are. And there are well-meaning fools in the middle of both kinds. If people want to commit devolutionary suicide, don't keep them in the gene pool. So my view is secession is preferable from victory, because you don't want those people. All those people, which is certainly in the order of 50 million, they're bad people. It could be more, it could be 70 million of them. They're bad, broken people. We don't want them. And if they want to go off and create that stuff, what'll happen? Their society will equilibrate or die. But they don't have to equilibrate when they can keep burning down our genetic middle class. We're letting them burn down society. We had a huge inheritance that was paid for over thousands of years by the hard work and suffering and whatever of our ancestors. And we're letting people come in and spend down the inheritance. And they call it the search for equality rather than hyper-consumption and the search for degeneracy.
Tragic state of affairs.
What's been happening is, of course, is that we used to be producing a norm. And what's happened since, the woke revolution is we're separating, because some of us really want to specialize in systematizing, conservatives, and the capitalization. And some of us want to specialize in infantilization or hyperconsumption. And the left sees conservatives as preventing their hyperconsumption for no reason. And the right sees the left's hyperconsumption as the destruction of capital that prevents them going forward with a high trust society. In other words, the right sees degeneracy and devolution and dysgenia, and the left sees unnecessary oppression. And really, at that level, that's all that's going on. It's just a supply-demand in adversarial competition, seeking an equilibrium between systematizing and empathizing, given the division of labor that says systematizing divides the population and the time, and empathizing divides the population and the time, and always seeking to produce trades. But it appears that as the incentive to compromise decreases, there's demand for speciation along systematizing and empathizing. And then you would get speciation in the systematizing and empathizing groups, the masculine biased female groups, along the similar empathic systemic distribution, but it would be normal within their group. So my view is that this is the reason we need to divide our polity, so that we can produce normal distributions that are resolvable at the scales that compromises are possible, because the information exists to produce compromises between the empathizing and systematizing within whatever strategy that female or male bias exists. What that means is we'd all regress toward the mean again, and then reunify over time or mediate over time, but we can't do it in a large polity, because there's no way to falsify your theories in a large polity. And the minute you have debt expansion like we have, you're eliminating the means by which empathizing and systematizing can compete, producing falsification of each of your theories, driving you back to the center. So in essence, we have to break up into groups that are smaller that can try to specialize, so that we can falsify our own beliefs without believing the other people are stupid or oppressive or evil. It can't be otherwise.
It has to do with the willingness to compromise.
It might be an information problem. In other words, you have to be able to form a group in order to come to consensus, the iron law of oligarchy. But if the scale of the groups are such that you can't come to consensus, in other words, it's too big, because there's too much noise in the system, or somebody's obtained an advantage, feminization of warfare, then what happens is everybody doubles down. They go to the extremes, which is just generating demand for separate polities. Once you generate demand for separate polities, each polity will form a normal distribution over time. Those normal distributions over time will become closer together than the attempt to produce closeness in a single organization at scale. There's no way of the information to be produced under continuous conflict between large numbers who are driven to polar opposites, because they see no need and no value in compromise. Yet if they were able to isolate, separate, form hard right and hard left, so to speak, extremes and stuff in the middle, what would happen is you'd eventually form a more moderate distribution in every single one of those, because the practical consequences would force you to. It's why big countries tend to be utopian and the smaller countries tend not to be, because they can't afford the lie, because they can't create the debt, because that's what enables lies. Well, which country is the biggest liar today? America. Why? Because we have the most debt. Why is Europe able to lie? Well, because America is allowing them to not pay the costs of self-maintenance so that they can instead fund the lie. But all we're doing is we're just making it so that lies are really cheap and truths are really hard, and adversarial competition between differences and margins can't equilibrate. And what we've done is we've left behind the agrarian age, which artificially forced large groups of people to cooperate with each other. And we've left behind the imperial age. The only value there is, and China's demonstrating this, the only value there is in scale is war. And the problem is a knowledge problem, and a knowledge problem is a problem of trust sufficiently to listen to the information, and the absence of means of distortion which allow you to lie, cheat, and steal. So you need small homogeneous polities that will produce high trust, maximizing adaptability that's possible for the group. And this United States nonsense and the Europe nonsense is just antithetical to the reason for European rapid evolution, which is the preservation of small states that form political, economic, and conceptual markets to compete with each other by people who can politically organize within a state in order to do so because they're small enough to be able to pursue a common interest. It's not escapable. Nothing's going to change. We can lie, cheat, steal, fib, whatever about it, but it's just science. Sorry, it's math. Sorry, this is going to happen. This is the way it is, and you can't fix it. The only thing you can do is try to deny it, which will produce what happens whenever you produce a denial, which is you decrease the rate of evolution to the point where either you stagnate or you collapse and decline, which is what happens. So there's no way around it. And when people think I'm in their favor or against them, I'm on everybody's side. Everybody's side is producing trades. Everybody's side is truth and reciprocity. And the only reason we can't get everybody on everybody's side using truth and reciprocity is we don't develop small enough, homogeneous enough polities to appeal to the interests of people so they don't have to lie. That's what drives me. The solution of the problem of modernity, which is simply populations at scale that are wealthy enough to respeciate, is just to break up into small groups that can produce political competition, that produce markets for polities that suit the interests of different people. And you can do that as long as you simply stay truth and reciprocal, and you make constitutions that are true and reciprocal. And if you want to have communism or socialism or fascism or whatever, just fine. But you can't make other people who don't want that have it. That's my project. And I tell people I'm a libertarian. What does that mean? My natural intuition is the elimination of conflict by the maximization of cooperation with a minimum interference using rule of law. You can't self-segregate your neighborhood. You can't regulate who comes into your neighborhood, which is what we all want. And so you go to cities where the dynamic does it, or you go into wealthy areas where it does it. So that means the average middle gets screwed because they can't self-isolate and preserve their high trust norms and the high trust commons. So our middle and working class get screwed because they don't have any way to isolate despite their income. We do the worst possible thing at all times under the belief that we're creating equality. What we're doing is just making human beings extraordinarily expensive to the point where there's no value in cooperating with one another. So the only way I would say to the right is I failed this in any degree, and I suppose I'll continue to fail it.
Oh my.
But the way you try to get around the hate speech thing is you have to recast what you call a moral via negativa. In other words, you have to stop criticizing them to the empirical via positiva that we need to succeed, given our emotional, moral, and cognitive differences aren't possible to ameliorate within the same polity anymore, because there's no longer need for male, female, interclass and intergroup regulation on one end, and the other end we can only achieve it through customizing our norms, traditions, values, commons, and polities to suit the demographic distribution of the intuitions of the people that live within the demographic. So we want to create political diversity in order to accommodate the optimum for diversity, and what they want to do is create homogeneity and monopoly in order to reduce everybody to the bottom. And so we have to somehow get over to that singular thing, because it's just their, what they call is fake news or their misinformation campaign includes advancing the disinformation and misinformation of equality and universality and ultimate compromise, which produces nothing but devolution and decline. That's what we would need to do as ourselves, is libertarians and conservatives and Christians and civic nationalists, is that we have to promote the restoration of the Constitution into the normal traditional European model of small states, each of which customizes its politics, its commons, its norms, traditions, values, and consumption to those which are in the interest of the group rather than dragging all the group to the bottom. That's what we would do. Now, how do we regulate it? I proposed this a couple of years ago, is we need to turn political speech into protected speech. If, in fact, as we see, political speech is just genetic speech in a polity that is polarized to the female and male methods, therefore, political speech is just like religion or just like sex or just like class, is an unchoosable disposition. It's an instinctual thing. So then if those other things can be protected speech and have to be allowed, then this has to be protected in speech and allowed too. And then we would have to simply stop hating each other. That'll never happen. But I mean, as intellectuals, we should try to frame the argument not as hate, but as institutional, political, social, economic incompatibility within the polity instead of our institutional, political, economic compatibility across polities by trade. In other words, it's proximity that creates hostility. And that's universal in the evidence. They can't deny it. And it's universal in how we sort into our own communities, even the largest cities. You have to understand that package. That's the Western package. And it's not an arbitrary. You can say, somebody asked me this morning, I'm like, well, I want to have a slightly different version of that because that cost is too high for my group. Agreed. Let us do the innovation because we enjoy it, and you take those proceeds, but don't drag down our rates of innovation because you can't tolerate our rates of adaptation. There's no reason everybody has to be the same. It just requires at least one group is maximizing evolution, and so that others can pick and choose their own rate of evolution. And then you get some groups that will choose not to evolve, and they'll pay the high cost of it and complain against the rest of us for being evil by demonizing us. I'm not saying you have to do this. I'm saying this is the scientific model by which we judge our political, social, economic, and intersexual, interpersonal traditions. And that knowledge is the only way of ameliorating those differences truthfully. I mean, you can have your little socialist paradise if you want. You're going to pay the freaking cost of it. But could I use the P law to produce a market for the suppression of corruption in a socialist government? Abso-freaking-lutely. There's no government you can't produce under P law. You just have to understand that you just have to do it truthfully, which means that if you want to produce the closest thing to communism, you're going to have a large legal market for the suppression of corruption. Whereas if you're going to produce rule of law and markets with a small administrative bureaucracy, you're going to have a smaller market for the suppression of production. And you're going to have a larger market for the suppression of attempts to privatize the commons or socialize losses like our financial and political sectors do. So, I mean, where are you going to want to put your adjudication? You're going to put it in against corruption in the state sector or corruption in the private sector, some equilibrium of both. However you want to do it, it doesn't matter. Choose what you want. So the thing is, it comes off as I'm stating the Europeans were right for all these reasons, but that's just the same reason we discovered science. It doesn't mean everybody has to do the same thing. It just means that if you want to do it your way, here's how to construct the law to do it your way while minimizing the bads. The importance of not destroying Western civilization is to leave at least one civilization that's providing continuous rapid evolution from which the rest of the civilizations can maintain. But this one world government is really just suicide. That's what it means. It means suicide. We want the opposite. The logo at the bottom here that I've now says, let 1,000 nations bloom. That's actually what we want. We want diversity of polities, not diversity in polities. You want diversity of polities because it maximizes opportunity for low power distance that can select optimum circumstances. But it doesn't mean that everybody has to be Japanese, South Korean, Anglo, and German. Not everybody has to be like us. We only have to be like us. Everybody else can be whatever they want. So it's when you start thinking of humanity as needing to be equal versus humanity needing to be a family, an extended family, with different specializations given the size of their family and the age of their family and the geography that they're in, that these families just have to, share whatever ideas they come up with that work, but that you don't want everybody to be equal because it can't happen. It can't happen without extreme suffering, which is what happens whenever the communists or the socialists get in charge. The communists will cause rapid decline, the socialists will cause semi-rapid decline, and the Islamists immediate decline, and the Ashkenazi, despite their interests, will cause rapid decline. I mean, within a village, you can develop your own whatever because that's what's needed. That's why we need free cities and we need free counties, is because the territories have different need for commons and different needs for responsibility over commons than cities do. And people are going to want to go to cities because the poor are, because that's where you have the highest difference in opportunity cost. Meanwhile, you have the highest concentration of wealth, which allows the highest redistribution. So it makes sense for the top and the bottom to go to cities. It makes sense for the productive middle to go to suburbs and out here and develop towns, which I'm going to use as my demarcation between city and town, is that it's a top and bottom and a town is a middle thing. And you'll have different social structures, different political deciding, and different taxation methods because people are taking on different responsibilities because they have different abilities. And that's what we need to do. If we burn the financial sector, we burn the globalists. We burn the globalists, we burn the problem. So my goal is that we complete this Constitution Declaration. We get enough people together, we all sign it, we deliver it to the Congress, which is, in our case, that's what a parliament is. And a parliament is simply the largest judiciary we have, the civil judiciary we have. We deliver it to Parliament, and Parliament has to make a choice. If the Parliament chooses that they're not going to allow us to separate and develop commons that are suitable to our individual interests, which is what the world is universally demanding once again, then they're the criminals and they're the oppressors, and we have the right of civil war. If they satisfy our demands, which is allow us to separate and develop the states as originally designed, which is a continuation of the Holy Roman Empire, which is a continuation of European civilization for 5,000 years, then okay, fine. Then we'll just separate into different states. Those states will separate into new states because basically we'll get city states out of some of those states, which are the international cities, will stay that way. We'll basically end the ability to migrate between states the way Europe had previously limited the ability to migrate between states. And then what you do in our part of the world is we raise our standard back to the old standard of behavior, and the bad people will leave us and go to those Axis cities, and the good people from the good cities will come here, and then we will repeat our creation of a vast open air museum and repetition of what we did in Europe. So I don't see this as a difficult problem. My only problem is, how do you get those 2 million guys to show up? Because really, you got to remember, there's only 200,000 soldiers in our military anymore, right? I mean, it's a small military. And, a very large portion of those people aren't going to disagree with us, especially if you see what we've promised the military.
There's an interesting thing which I wanted to discuss with you some, is these city states, free city states. The nearest example I can come up with in my mind is Danzig.
Well, it's one of them. A free city basically gets to pay its own way. So in general, the aristocracy was agrarian and they were concerned about territories. But as these cities came up, they had developed trade networks. I mean, if you want to understand European history, we should study the German history, and we should study the Hansa. So a city-state, this is where liberty comes from. So what does freedom mean? It means you're not a slave. It isn't a positive assertion. It's a negative assertion. You're not a slave. You're a freeman. What does a citizen mean? It means the polity insures you. The state is insuring you. So you can travel and you're insured, right? I mean, like they'll send the army out if anything happens to you. So that's what citizenship. But what does liberty mean? The origin of liberty is that you're able to maintain local customs. So a ruler would take over your territory, but you would maintain your local customs, your local laws. And this is one of the things that kept our legal system very light. This hierarchy of, so the state only worried about things that threaten the state. Social problems are yours. Unless it threatens the state, go ahead. Well, it's the same thing with free cities. Free cities developed non-local networks of trade. And so they had to have different customs in order to maintain those trade networks. So you would let people who were foreigners develop a quarter because it was useful for that. Whereas you wouldn't let those foreigners into the territory. because that would undermine the social cohesion of the people who were there, the villages. The second thing is it doesn't require the rest of the people to pay for your ships, your navy, or even guarding your ships. So a free city was required to pay for its own costs in exchange for having the liberty to have its own customs and laws, as long as those laws and customs didn't impede the state. For all intents and purposes, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco have already declared the federal government's laws null and void. They've already done it. They've already acted as free cities. Fine, you've already seceded. Let's just acknowledge it. And then we can reduce this federal government back to the balance between international cities and national territories and towns, and we'll maintain the norms and traditions. Why? Because people don't really get this, is that one of the reasons you go to a city is to be vacated of responsibility for the commons. And this is a caretaking thing. One of the reasons you go to the suburbs, the rural area, is because you can take responsibility for commons, and we feel good about responsibility. So when the urbanites think they're doing good by expanding their irresponsibility, what we're doing is we're being deprived of our self-worth and self-value because we are responsible. And this is important because opportunity costs in the territories are much higher than opportunity costs in the urban areas. I mean, that's the whole thing about population density, is that that's where the density creates value, is it reduces opportunity costs. You produce a lot of negative externalities because nobody's responsible any longer. And so you create demand for an authoritarian state by the fact, in other words, city, because people are no longer responsible. Whereas out here, we create the opposite. We create an opposition to an authoritarian state because people are responsible. And people feel good about being responsible. And it's a means of rejecting people from your polity because they're irresponsible, just like the people in the cities reject conservatives because they want to be responsible. So this economy is the natural progress of the different systems of opportunity costs and the natural human difference in female preference for hyperconsumption, which is why there's a disproportionate number of women in New York and DC and disproportionate number of men in Seattle and San Francisco. Because productivity is out in the West now, and women are in New York with financial sector and in DC with the political sector. So those are Washington, DC, and New York City are ovary graveyards. I mean, if you want to find an attractive 40-year-old woman who's ridden the cock carousel, just change your dating site to New York City. I mean, if it's the same thing in LA, I'm a dancer. Right? How many 40-year-old dancers or actresses or whatever?
Yes, the natural consequence of what we're doing is Brazil. This is why we have to separate. Frankly, we got to wall them in. We go to the German and the Greek and Roman method of city-states. And once you have a certain population, you get to have your own city-state, and you're divorced from the territory around you because your opportunity cost per capita is just so low in a city, but your rent seeking is so high. So you're going to have cities with top and bottom against the middle, and you're going to have the outside having the middle. And we're already seeing that. What we want to prevent is the spread of the contagion. The European Union was designed to collapse Europe. Well, the European Union was based on the false premise that Europe could imitate the authoritarianism of the federal government in America. But as we see, the federal government in America has lost legitimacy. So instead, America was designed as a continuation of the European strategy, particularly the Holy Roman Empire, which is a collection of small states federated militarily and judicially under a very weak government that basically had nothing other to do than to determine the legitimacy of the rulers of any given of the small states. So that's what our tradition was. The Civil War, of course, which was really a war over the expansion of control into the territories. That war was conducted for that reason. Slavery was one of the key points there, but it was military, strategic, and economic and political as well. So had Atlanta won, of course, the Northeast would have been isolated and the South would have ruled from east to west was a catastrophe. So the French, of course, are the most feminine group, an authoritarian group, so they wanted to repeat the Napoleonic conquest and simply produce an imitation of the US so that Europe could be as powerful as the US was on the world stage. Well, the difference is that, that project is failing because you can't homogenize our people, and we don't want to because it's bad for us to be homogenized. And the US is failing because we reached a population density and a cultural diversity somewhat like the Europeans have, which is the natural thing for our people. And as such, we're seeing pressure to devolve the federal government back to its original status, just like we're seeing resistance to the expansion of the euro. Fundamentally, all anybody cares about is the borrowing capacity of the Germans and the borrowing capacity of the federal government here. I mean, it's just nothing else to it.
A loose federation of Germanic states that continued the over 1,000 years of the Holy Roman Empire, which itself is a continuation of the Roman and Greek model, and which is the ancestral European model, which is different from other models. In that model, you just produce a lot of polities because that's the only thing you can do when your primary criteria of decidability is citizenship earned by reciprocal defense of individual sovereignty. It's the only government possible. So the only question is, how do you put that into place to devolve the post-war imperial bureaucracy back to its original Germanic intentions? Well, you just state the rule of law and you devolve the government to that point. Now, what part of the government don't you want to devolve? Well, you don't want to devolve the insurer functions because insurance only is most valuable at scale. So you maintain the insurer of last resort functions, but which are all via negativas. Defense, insurance, we think of as pooling money for risk management, disaster recovery, general monetary system. You preserve all those means of necessity, but you push the rest down to the states like it was originally judged. You prohibit the central state from making any laws outside of its domain again, and you return the federal judiciary to something as simply adjudication of disputes between states over property. We restore the original design of the country from its utopian designs that were a result of the Marxist, neo-Marxist postmodern warfare against the institutional cultural productions by denying the laws of nature exist. The false promise. We just eradicate the false promise, which you can only fake with financialism, which is why the enemy uses financial systems, and you put it back down into the states where accounting is still possible. And then you just say anybody can form any state they want, which means that there's no longer urban capture of rural territories. And you basically turn into free cities, meaning liberal cities, and conservative states. And you'll see the normal historical trend evolve of the states serving top and bottom at the expense of the middle. And you'll see the middle building in the territories where they focus on producing commons that increase high investment parenting, while the cities destroy high investment parenting in exchange for numbers. So when you ask me, how do you bring it in? I don't fucking know. I mean, the only way I know is to have a revolution, an uprising is the right word, a resistance movement that says, we're going to have a war unless you do this, because what you're doing is immoral. And this is the science behind what we're doing. And all your arguments are gone. In other words, you don't have any moral arguments to defend yourself from being criminals, despite that you've justified the fact through all this crap illusions you've told yourself in the academy, the media, the entertainment sector, the finance sector, and the state. You've created all these beautiful lies to tell yourself that you're doing good. You're actually criminals. And we're going to criminalize your behavior, which is going to be at least 2/3 of it. You're who gets screwed, but you know who benefits? All the rest of us left and right. That's who benefits. So we're going to burn you on the stake. You can either take burning virtually by your income, and then you can search out useful places in the population, but we're going to take it from you because whether you're leftist or right, which the people on my side, of course, the right hate that I say this, it's just as advantageous for the left as it is for the right. We're going to split this up, and then we're going to go back to the original design because that's the only scientific design for a human population that doesn't fall into those errors that we already know. So I don't know how to get there any other way, and I know how to produce that revolution. I just don't want to get shot or sent to prison or something in order to do it. I'd like to do it peaceably. But the only way to do that is to get attention enough to control the discourse. And to get attention enough to control that discourse, you have to produce enough of a threat to control the narrative because we don't have a way of baiting all those institutions into surrendering. There's no way you morally convince a criminal who's justified his crimes to stop doing it. The only way you get a criminal out of office is to prosecute and punish them. Well, we're saying we won't punish you, right, if this happens. In other words, if you agree. But if you don't agree, you're leaving us with no choice but punishment. And if punishment happens, I'm telling you, it's going to get way the fuck out of hand. Everybody knows this because every time it gets out of hand, it goes way out of hand. So let's not go way out of hand. Let's get the left and right together. Say, you want what you want, and you're right. You need that. We want what we want, and we're right. We need this. And we can separate, we can cooperate by trade and defense, but we don't need to cooperate in commons and norms and traditions and values. So the people we have to burn, who made up the term oversupply of elites?
That's it. Turchin.
Turchin. So Turchin's right. The people we're going to burn is the people who are parasites. The problem is the parasites don't know they're parasitic and they don't know they're criminals. And the parasites don't know they're criminals. And that the law is the cheapest, most kind, most effective way of using an exterminator on the behavior, not the people, the behavior of the parasites and criminals.
Say Jesus said it, don't hate the sinner, hate the sin.
You can say, we're going to produce as close to the communist model as possible, and we're going to do it by these means. And our system of measurements are this. And if these measurements fail, we'll do this. It's just you can't make false promises. And the answer, of course, is that'll always fail. But what you can do is produce a high-low government, which is what the majority want, really. Most people want to be serfs. They want to be serfs. They want to do as little as possible. They want to spend as much time not adapting. And they want to be able to blame the upper class for their oppressions. But they want the rule. Most people want that. They just want not to starve while doing that. Then the rest of us are going to feel very differently. We're going to feel differently that we want to create high quality commons for high trust families. We're going to take responsibility in order for those returns. And so you're going to have high investment parenting and high trust polities that are majority middle class because we suppress the parasitism of the underclass, even if it's just reproductive parasitism. And you're going to have those that don't, and fine. And we'll have exactly what history has demonstrated. You'll have authoritarian cores that are hyper wealthy around vast ring slums, and you'll have territorial lands where people live in virtual gardens. And yes, there will be more hyper-consumptive freedom in those cities, and those technologies will leak out as arts and whatever, and you'll have different things that leak back in. The difference is you just can't lie. Can't conduct warfare by any means. If you can't make it work on your own, you can't have it. So you can't conduct warfare by any means. And it does work to have an aristocracy and a peasantry. It absolutely works. It's most of history. And people will complain, but their absence of responsibility is a luxury good they prefer. Whereas us, we prefer the luxury good of responsibility and status instead. Well, which luxury good do you want? And people don't understand. It's really hard to be a Northern European. It's really fucking hard. It's only easy for us because we're bred for it. You know, German shepherds just do their thing. Australian shepherds, right? They do their thing. It's not work for them. It's play. For us, this is play. For other people, it's not. Especially the more emotional you are, the more neurotic sensitivity you are. So you see this. Why did Asian people always gravitate to certain circumstances, even after they've been fully integrated? So you see this, you know, and we tend to put it into a class structure because that's our mind, but it works across races as well as classes. So there are natural gravitational needs for different peoples, or wants, biases in different people. And there are obvious historical reasons that aren't completely natural. Yeah, we can mask some of it with wealth. But once wealth is attained, in other words, once I have an equilibrium, I'm going to devote to expression of my intuitions. So what have we seen in the wealthiest, most equalitarian? We see men and women going different directions, not the same. Well, why do you think that's not going to happen among the races or classes? It is. So what's happened is we've exhausted the opportunity for scale. Because really, what's the only value of political scale? Military. What do nuclear weapons do? They eliminate the value of political scale. So what's the only remaining value of political scale? Borrowing capacity. What happens if you give a state excess borrowing capacity? It creates destruction of the middle class. Essentially, men are the cell wall between the female nucleus, and their little offspring, and the universe outside the wall. The problem is that the women perceive the cell wall as the universe when we're just acting as a filter for that universe. And until they know how to look at their emotions and see them as doing that, they won't be able to understand what men are doing. It's like men understand what women are doing. Conservatives understand what liberals are doing. Liberals can't imagine what conservatives are doing. Women can't imagine what men are doing. So men look at women and say, well, they're crazy. And women look at men and say they're stupid. It's not. It's just I gauge temperature and you gauge air pressure. And together we can predict the weather. The difference is the barometer doesn't know the temperature, and then the thermometer doesn't know the barometric pressure. And the problem is we have this thing about equality, which is a bunch of bullshit that says we're equal. We're not. Our sensory registers map the world differently. And given our preferences we now are wealthy enough to pursue, we will pursue increasingly feminine and increasingly masculine interests because we don't need to compromise. Well, what do you think is going to happen if we liberate male and female wills, intuitions, so that they seek the maximization of their internal biases? Well, you'll get that expressed in the individual, which we see it throughout the workforce, and we see it throughout all of life, but you'll also get the desire for those people, whether male or female, whether cognitively male, not biologically male or female, those people are going to sort into demand for commons now that further advance those interests. Right. So that's what's happening. So my point is that farming was an artificial period because we ran into absolute scarcity. In other words, we ate everything. So we had to compromise. And so we had to develop these things like marriage and all these norms and traditions and institutions. But the problem is there's no need to compromise anymore. We don't even need to compromise at the family level. And we certainly don't need to compromise at the polity level. So we can either keep both trying to preserve the agrarian order, which was the abnormality in human evolutionary history, instead of discover the new order that's possible at this new stage of evolutionary history, which is going to be a lot more like the hunter-gatherer period than it has been like the agrarian period, because we're less dependent upon these territorial scarce resources and containing them and cooperating to make very little productivity come out of whatever sunlight's available under conditions of maternal high risk. We're just not into that period. We're not in the industrial period anymore, where we can take those people who under farming had been genetically predisposed, at least in the West and Far East, to increase the quality of human capital, to make a marginal difference in the productivity under farming, and this because of the sociability under farming. We're now out of the industrial age and into, oh shit, not only have we exhausted the capital available from industrialization, but we've now taken those people who were built up capital and made them irrelevant. And so there's no workforce to be made from that. So what are we going to do? Well, we can continue to try to build this economy that's based on the production of consumption. We can do what the communists were thinking, which is take the workforce that can't otherwise be employed in markets and put it into the production of commons. So the problem is, I'm writing down the law of Mother Nature. Sorry, it's the end of the line for this discourse. The question is, once we know whether we all abandon Mother Nature and just go to our demise, whether we find some compromise with Mother Nature, which is separation and pursuit of our interest, which is the normal evolutionary strategy, or we defeat those who are trying to destroy mankind through their quote compassion, which is really just hyperconsumption. So we have three choices. We have the knowledge to make the choice.
It's like this. The satisfaction of intuitions may be mutually incompatible, which necessitates separation or warfare.
I can't expect everybody to agree with everything.
That's
the
correct.
Only thing they need to agree with is the right to self-determination. Is the only reason we don't have to conquer and oppress others is if they don't do the same. So if Christians want the right to self-determination by a Christian polity, then the law says they can. And what would happen is, of course, is that parts of, especially the Bible Belt, would institute Christianity as a state religion. They would just teach it. And it would probably be just fine. Whereas if you're going to have some atheist sort of dream world, which is sort of upper middle class fantasy, then go ahead. You'll just pay the price of it. I just see it as in the past, prior to the agrarian age, prior to the density of population, you just took some men who were capable and went out into new territory, and you isolated, you specialized, and you speciated. That's why there are 4 races, because of separation, isolation, adaptation, and speciation. Well, why aren't we just returning to a world where we're speciating, this time not just by geography, which is what the races did, but speciated by sexual bias? Why not just go that direction? The answer, of course, is that the female bias always dies or causes collapse. So let's let them go off and collapse. But why pay the cost of dragging people who hate you along? I mean, we have learned this over and over again in European civilization, is that our thing doesn't scale because other humans aren't fit for it. Deal with it.
So it's like
And even among our own, only some of us are fit for it.
it caused me to consider the colonial enterprise of Europe, the globalization of Europe, to create a global enterprise which failed. I can only say it failed. It didn't work because it's like that was rejected by the rest of the world, essentially. Is that
because they can't do it? They're not capable of doing it. The Middle Eastern way works the opposite. They drag everybody to the bottom. But we can't pull everybody to the top. They can't do it. Why they can't do it, whether it's cultural or genetic or a combination, is a matter for heated debate. But it appears to be that intuitions of a minority can be tolerated, but intuitions of the majority are always expressed. In other words, it appears that racial differences are always meaningful.
writing that down?
Sexual differences certainly are. Class differences are. It certainly looks like racial differences are. That doesn't mean that there is some percentage of each race that can fit into our model. There is. There's some percentage of each race that's rational enough to fit into our model. But a third of our women are crazy. What percent of the Middle Eastern men are crazy? It's more than half. So what are you going to do? That's why I say the moral solution is separation, not just because it's easier and cheaper, but because we get rid of the people we don't want. They get rid of us, we get rid of them. They'll burn themselves down like they always do. And we'll just do what we've always done, which is build a high quality commons, because the demand for high quality commons, in order to survive in it, suppresses those behaviors that the left can't control.
Interesting that I hear the voices calling for separation coming from the left as well at this time.
Right, and it's the right answer. And it's the country was designed this way because the Holy Roman Empire was designed this way, because the Greek city-states and the Roman Empire was designed this way. You only need law. The reason you need law is for trade. Everything else doesn't fucking matter. If you have law and loyalty to the law, they called it loyalty to the state, but their version of state was just the Roman law, Code Civilis. So if you have the loyalty to the law, you can create whatever polity you want. It's just commerce. We don't have to conflate cooperation by productivity, in other words, trade, in the production of consumption. We can cooperate that way easily across nations, but we don't have to cooperate in the production of commons because we vary dramatically in our need for commons. People with high impulse, if you're not East Asian or West European, your impulsivity is going to be fairly high. If you're female rather than male, your impulse is going to be somewhat higher. Your impulse against rationality or reason is. We're just in that situation. So let's just solve the problem, which is to go back to how we don't look at European civilization as successful because we don't think of it as unifying. We unified under a church that used natural law to limit the authority of states over their people. It was genius. The thing is, we have the natural law empirically now instead of theologically and hidden in all this superstition and nonsense that prohibits technological growth. The optimum social order is the European. You just need a lot of polities because polities form a market for the production of commons, and people can sort into those commons they want. You will get Italians.
It appears the key difference that causes people to separate is their intuitional needs are satisfied by the creation of certain commons.
Correct.
And it is
Trade is optional, commons are not. This is the problem, is commons aren't optional. And so what we need is the ability to produce commons that are suitable for our people. You wonder why there's this vertical band of civilizations across Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. You look at that until you look at the genetics, you say, oh, there's genetic bands across Europe from Spain to the Urals. They talk about diversity as if it's a good thing. No, it's a really bad thing. Ethnocentrism and a homogenous polity that's marginally indifferent is the optimum social, political, and economic order, period, because it's the most willing to produce commons. Because nobody's fighting you for power. Nobody's competing against your genetic interests. Nobody's fighting against you for anything. But the way you want diversity is in states, so that people who produce different states can go to them. I mean, there's a reason some of us like to live in California and some of us prefer Alaska, right? I mean, I don't like Alaska. People are weird. I love it. There's a marginal difference in our want for commons right now. There's a huge marginal difference in our demand for commons, but it's not unhealthy or unnatural. It's a return to normal. We don't think of agrarianism. All our literature, all our history, all our myths, all our traditions, all our religions, all our philosophies, all our political theories, all of it comes from the period of agrarianism, except we're not there anymore. None of those constraints or those benefits are true anymore. So all those things we depend upon. The same thing is, what's the value of marriage now? It's getting questionable. Now it's going to return because our economic advantage is going to decrease. But the reality remains that if a woman needs to produce 2 point whatever children on average, and X percentage of them would prefer to live alone and take care of their own children without a male, males are going to go back to the previous organization as well, where there are men's orders like we had prior to the destruction of them by feminists in the 60s and 70s. We're going to go back to men's orders, and these kind of things will happen. Well, the same thing's going to happen in polities. We're going to have people generate demand for caretaking policies because they get a status perk out of taking care of this vapid underclass. And there's some of us who want to produce productive societies with a majority middle class. And those two things can emerge, because that's what's always emerged in the past. The difference is we don't have to take each other down. We can just go our separate ways. And we know it works because the entire history of the success of Europe is based on that model. And the failure of every other civilization is based on every other model. It's not fucking complicated. If you understand it's just computation, that's all that's going on, then you don't have all this moralizing and righting and wronging. You say, we need vehicles for computing our best interest given our genetic composition, which produces our genetic intuitions, which we then organized into a social model that's marginally indifferent. And each of these excellences will emerge. You'll get certain kinds of excellences in each model, and people will take that as a technological innovation. So diversity, in the sense that the left means it, which is dragging everybody to the bottom, which is the communist, Abrahamic, Islamic, Jewish, Christian model, dragging everybody to the bottom.
So I call it universal homogenization, okay?
Right. What it does is it destroys the market ability to compute differences.
It's just computation, and we need vehicles for computing. And the vehicles for computing is polity.
A market computes. It computes by trial and error because it's always facing too much information to be consolidated by any other means. The problem is that if you have a lot of small markets, it's like having a lot of small computers. They compute excellences. They don't spend most of their time computing conflicts. And the only way to compute a conflict is through lying, cheating, deceiving, social construction, and undermining. So what's happened is most of our political discourse has adopted the female method, which is undermining, because there's no other solution once you've moved that kind of conflict into politics. In other words, democracy is the worst possible system for heterogeneous polity. It's absolutely going to, deterministically, without exception, no qualifications ever made, going to result in authoritarianism, which is what everybody's always known throughout history. But the liberals, like women, can't get it out of their heads. They're not normal, and everybody can agree with them. But who's producing all those fucking comments now? Uh-oh, what happens when all the men check out? Well, you're seeing it. It's just a disequilibrium. So we have to understand that the agrarian age is over. The industrial technological age is here. What we thought was going to happen in industrialization is going to be worse than the benefit that gained from it for the people at the bottom, because we've already used the bottom up. The next part is that women have come into this thing, and that we didn't prohibit the antisocial behavior of women, which is what we see in PC woke Marxism, postmodernism. And then we opened the politics up to intersexual dispute. So it's just this catastrophe of lies, and there's no market system for solving it.
No compromise is possible.
There's nothing possible. You can't even have a rational discussion. So the only solution is violence. And so what I'm saying is, let's not be violent. Let's solve the freaking problem. The reason I talked about civil war is I want people to understand it's going to happen unless we stop it. It's not that I'm trying to make it happen. It's going to happen. So the question is, how can I provide everybody with a moral reason to force the government into a separation of commons so that people can go back to self-determination by self-determined means and sort into those polities that, I mean, California already sorted. There's a kind of person that goes there. The kind of person who goes to California wants attention. They want to consume. The kind of person who goes to New York, they want something else, or DC, something else. The kind of person who goes to suburbia or the rural areas, they want something else. Mostly to not have to continuously compete for people, like for status, because it doesn't matter to them. They care about not being bad. They don't care about climbing the ladder. But if you can be stupid enough to be baited into a ladder that is only dependent upon hyperconsumption, the consequences of which is your absence of reproduction, you're just a fucking idiot. So we're already sorting. Let's finish the sorting. Let's make it possible. Let's make it so that the people in the center who have traditional values can produce a high quality, high trust, high quality commons, low cost of individual income. We can build another Disney World like we've made out of Europe. And if they want to build urban glory in a downtown set of squares and favelas all around them, which is what always happens when you do what they do, go ahead. Just remember that we're going to put up a wall and not let you cross it. You start with a set of demands and a solution, and then you seize attention. Now, my version of seizing attention is to get 1 million guys to show up and say, we're not going home until we have this. And then you force the conversation. The only way to force the conversation when we're at this stage of catastrophe is the threat of warfare. So you have to create a viable threat in order to bring a state to the table, because the state is the enemy. It's not the left. We're happy to give, or I am happy to give them what they want. They just have to have their 15 cities or whatever it is and go their own way. The only value is that we have to prevent the disassociation of our island. In other words, we can't give away territory. So the military has to stay the same. In other words, the military has to govern the borders the way it does, better than it does today. And then if you're a city, you want to bring in a bunch of immigrants to keep your debt cycle working, good luck. You can't export them, though, to the rest of us. You're stuck with them. So that's what they'll do. And they'll build favelas with very low labor costs and a very small upper class that rules from an urban center. And they'll have a vast peasantry. And we'll be like Europe, trying to keep the East at bay again. That's what'll happen. The other answer is we get 1 million people together and we say, this is going to be the way it is, and fuck the liberals. I just think that's pointless. We don't want them. They're a genetic disaster area. How do we bring this about without killing, more people than we killed in the Civil War?
That's right. How can you do this peaceably?
You can. You just say, you tell people the truth. We're going to have a civil war, and lots of millions of people are going to die because of the way the United States is organized. If something simple happens, like you lose electricity for 6 months, we never come back. So is that worth it? Or would you like to just separate into urban free cities, in other words, liberal free cities and conservative free states? Would you just prefer to do that? Because that's our difference. We all pay some tax for the government, whatever. That doesn't mean anything, because we still need to defend the territory. And then, of course, I would say that we prohibit people in the cities from political and military participation, because that's what we've done in the past. You let them develop their own police forces, and we just conduct everything by trade, and that will work just flawlessly, because All the shitty people will go to the cities. The good people in the cities who want good quality of life will go to the places with superior commons where they can raise families and children. We'll self-sort into those things. The cities will turn into South America, Brazil and the Middle East. If that's what makes them happy, fine. Because a lot of people would rather be equal in poverty and be able to complain about the elites than they would actually be responsible for creating and preserving the conditions that make a high trust middle class, majority middle class possible. Why? Because their status will always be lower. If you're an elite and you're an unproductive elite and you make your money by talking or financing or scheming or plotting, then you want all those ignorant people at the bottom who don't want your power. So it's always the middle, the highly productive middle, against the unproductive elites and unproductive underclass. We don't need to be universal.
No need for universality.
It's destructive. Sexual dimorphism produces the greatest behavioral, cognitive, intuitionistic, and physical difference. That's the largest axis of variation among our venues of variation, and it's remained that way still. The stable relation that's emerged is cooperation that prevents us from failure in any direction. The explanation of sex is the major cause of increases in computation would lead us not only to all of our history, but to the present bifurcation or return to normal, because agrarianism was an abnormal period. It created an artificial need for all sorts of cooperation, given the differences in male and female reproductive strategies and costs. Whereas in the present day, what we're seeing is those costs have been ameliorated by male development of various sciences and technologies. As such, the female and the male are now able and willing and desirous of fulfilling their group strategies, which is to fulfill their cognitive intuitions rather than compromise. And so we have a demand now for male and female polities, cognitively biased and morally biased and commons biased polities. The same way in the past, we had a demand for males to leave behind some tribe and go out and expand new territory so they could more easily fulfill the male reproductive strategy. What we're entering now is a simple expression of the female desire is becoming overwhelming because we let it, and the male desire is seeking to separate from that female desire because it's harmful to the reproductive strategy. So the fundamental issue is we didn't maintain the compromise between the male and females by equally suppressing the female system of warfare, which is how the first generation of Abrahamic religions and the second generation of Abrahamic religions we're under now are just an expression of the female system of warfare in PC woke and whatever, Marxism, postmodernism, PC woke, anti-whiteness. These are just anti-male systems of warfare. We didn't equally suppress it. Now, it leads to the question of then why should we? Why don't we just separate and let those crazy chicks go their own way? And what'll happen is that what happens in every civilization that adopts the female strategy, it dies or degenerates. So where does that leave us? That leaves us making a choice. The choice is not to let the female strategy win. It's to either force the female strategy back into the same level of suppression and the same emphasis on cooperation that we have done with the male, or to separate and let them die off and save ourselves 500,000 years of evolution.
The funny thing about it is we don't get to choose if other people cooperate with us. We only choose our own behavior. How do we feel? It doesn't matter. You just have to feel that like if those are the options and that's how it goes. Even the lefties are talking about separating away now.
Which is what we want.
It's okay. It's just, it doesn't
No,
matter.
it's perfect. What'll happen is we'll separate. They'll follow the continuous course. We'll raise the standard of behavior such that their behavior is intolerable and illegal. They'll eventually die because hyperconsumption can't survive.
It's okay.
That's okay. You have a tiny elite that maintains the minimum amount of order at the maximum amount of extraction, and the rest of the civilization gets to be relatively equal in poverty, which is what most people seem to prefer, because they get to complain about the upper class, but not have to do anything about it. Whereas what we do is we create the majority middle, which means everybody's responsible, everybody's accountable, and everybody contributes, and nobody gets to complain because that's just trying to steal. The sequence is We either get defeated by the females and the female intuition, the female strategy that favors the underclass, and we fall into decline and dysgenia like every other civilization did by 800 AD, or we conquer and we prevent the dysgenic from happening, or we separate and let nature do its thing. The peaceful optimum is, of course, to let nature do its thing and see if the female minds do discover something useful and the male might do discover something useful, and let competition do its thing, just as it has between civilizations. Take away the federal government's ability to destroy culture diversity, and America would turn into Europe, which is what it was designed to be. There's a big difference between even Los Angeles and New York, right? I mean, it's culture shock to go between those two things. It's culture shock even to go to two cities that are similar, which is like Atlanta and Chicago. The United States would easily, rapidly evolve into a set of states very quickly reflecting the same distribution as in Europe, with the coastal interests being coastal interests and the interior continental interests being interior continental interests. And we would see the same emergence, which is what the country was designed to do, is reflect the ancestral history of the European peoples, which was really the Holy Roman Empire of many, many small Germanic states, for instance. We focus too much on the period of Spain, France, the Dutch, and England that gives birth to the Americas, but we don't spend enough time on the over 1,000 years of the development of the Holy Roman Empire and its restoration of what had been Mediterranean civilization in the Baltic and North Sea. The North Sea is basically a lake that facilitates transport. So the Hansa built these free cities. The cities had their own laws. Those cities could have specialized laws. But then again, the cities were able to pay for their own militaries. They paid for their own navies, their own militaries, and they had their own interests. But those interests diverged enough from the countryside that the politics of the cities and the countryside had to be different. Well, a lot of this is the background for our civilization.
I talk to people about the concept of separation. It's not that we're all standing on top of a ridge line tied together, and I want you to step away from the ridge line. It's half of us have already jumped off. I want you to cut the rope before you get dragged over. That's the separation I'm talking about.
Against the institutions of cultural production, so that we maintain this. And the only solution once you do that is a stable equilibrium, which is exchange. If exchange isn't possible on commons, the only solution is separation. Now, I don't know what's very controversial about that. So I conduct science. If they want to conduct philosophy, that's okay with me, but it's not science. So you can't claim it's true or it's good. You can only say that you've selectively avoided trying to cheat Mother Nature and developing some cunning path to a resolution, except that everybody's trying to develop a different cunning path with a different sense of logic and a different sense of values, and they all end up why they can't figure out why they can provide an answer. The answer is the only solution is trade, in other words, reciprocity. The only trade is possible if trade is beneficial. If trade isn't beneficial to your strategy, in other words, trade within the polity, then the only thing is trade external to the polity. If trade external to the polity isn't possible, then boycott is the correct value. So we should separate internally to the masculine and feminine. What would happen, of course, is that the feminine would quickly learn that they reduce to the Middle East like favelas, and the masculine capitalizing would eventually always and everywhere maintain production of excellences. And so there would be an increasing defect rate by those capable of adopting higher suppression of impulse and greater capitalization to the masculine society, which is what always happens. It's why men leave to get away from parasitism to produce their own societies. And then the parasites move in and consume all the available capital until this process is repeated. That's what's called the expansion of mankind. So there's nothing special here.
What's interesting is this, as I'm watching these guys talking about the dating thing, and that's exactly the energy that they're putting out. Is like, just walk away from these ladies because they're not right. There's nothing right about them. They're consumers. They're not bringing anything positive to the engagement. They are not, they're not friendlies.
But if they marry the state, and they extract from men through the state, then the only solution is separation. So you have to get a state that defends their capital. Well, what will happen, of course, is these men will produce capitalization rather than hyperconsumption. I mean, what they're just doing to America, to the West, is destroying Western civilization one city at a time. So what you have to do is create new cities where the destruction of capitalism is possible. Well, what'll happen is people will sort. They'll be stuck with all the losers and the parasites. But what they have in South America is exactly that. You have an elite that lives in an urban core surrounded by a vast favela. Maybe the elites don't mind that. Maybe
No,
the
the
peasants
elite seem
don't
to
mind that.
prefer it.
So let them have it. And so we'll have a civilization of middles and a civilization of top and bottoms. And maybe that's what we need, because if you look historically, Europe is a civilization of middles. China tried to get there, and everybody else had either the hierarchy of India or the vast unwashed bottoms of the rest of the world. It's not like there's anything new here.
No, it looks to me like separation is desirable and doable.
Advantageous, because we want commons that are incompatible. And the purpose of a government is the production of commons. And so if they want a hyperconsumptive commons and they want a low adaptive commons, that's
okay.
fine.
That's okay.
We want a highly adaptive commons. We want a highly capitalizing commons, because we can afford families of high quality, high investment parenting if we reduce the cost of basically everybody's existence. The way you do that, of course, is you eliminate all the things you need to defend yourself and your children against, which of course is malincentive, bad behavior, falsehood, parasitic lifestyles, drugs, prostitution, and anything that is appealing to the intuition as a means of cheating the demand for adaptation. So we just raise the standard of behavior such that it's illegal to do so many things, and we return the average person to the responsibility for policing those commons. Therefore, people will just leave. It's like, I talked to, I can't remember where it was, it depends on how aggressive your police are. So if your police are really aggressive, the crackheads and the meth manufacturers leave the area. It's just too costly.
Yes.
And they go to areas with more lenient laws. Just like the bums and whatever go to San Francisco and Seattle.
It looks to me like a trade. It looks like a market solution to the problem.
It's a market solution to a trade, which is what everything I do does. It says, what is the market solution to the problem whereby we're limited to conducting trades and we cannot conduct warfare? That's it. So like I said, I'm a libertarian.
The incompatibility of the commons is a product of satisfying the intuitions of the various participants in the trade.
They live in a world of intuition and belief.
Right.
It's very hard to get them to understand that people intuit and believe differently than they do and still believe they're doing good. So it's hard to get them to saying, well, we just want to capitalize and you want to consume.
No, they won't say that. No, they won't agree to that premise.
They think in social construction because they're creatures of social construction. We're creatures of universal existence, in other words, rather than social construction.
So they use normative, which is cultural production, normative control, which is they're seeking to modify the culture without your permission because you're bad. And it's like, okay, you don't get to do that. It's war. That's just war.
Well, I mean, they have to understand in any negotiation, which is what I tell people in relationship, all relationships are just a matter of stating the truth. The truth is that's what they desire, and this is why. This is what we desire, and which is why. These are two different group evolutionary strategies. Those strategies are incompatible. They have a genetic origin. They're not alterable. There's a third of us who are extremely feminine in consciousness, liberals, a third of us that are extremely masculine, and a third of us that are somewhere in the middle, which are basically pragmatic. So fine, separate, and the third in the middle will choose. You can have your world and we can have ours. There's no reason Chicago has to remain part of Illinois. Because if you look at the success of the Hansa, the cities separated from the states.
Yes.
Right. And that's what we need to do is we have cities that need to separate from the states because the states have different interests than the cities. There's nothing new about this phenomenon. It's just that we're in a position now where we have two different sets of lifestyles, the urban hyperconsumptive and dysgenic, and the rural hypercapitalizing and eugenic. And that's fine. Well, the reason they're eugenic is to keep costs down. And the reason that they're dysgenic is to keep costs down. They're trying to keep two different costs down. One is the cities don't want to pay the cost of adaptation, in other words, of self-discipline. And the people who are raising families don't want to pay the cost of having indiscipline. And so it's just two different cost savings. So yeah, fine. You want to have hyper consumption. You want to have less responsibility. It's just you can't impose that on the rest, and the rest don't want to impose it on you. And the third in the middle will just choose what's pragmatic. The difference is we will escalate highly our suppression of this behavior, and you'll continue yours. And the outcome will be that, of course, you will pay the costs of your choices, and we'll pay the costs of our choices. You just can see this pattern across people. So can everybody use this model of P-law? Well, it's just science. But from science, you can apply it to engineering. Well, what's government? It's
Right.
engineering with law.
Social engineering. Yeah.
So now you can engineer what you need. Now, some groups need more centralized control because they're lower trust. Some groups don't need it much. I mean, versus everybody wants to be like Denmark. Okay, breed a population of Danes. You're not going to get there in South Central Africa. It's just not going to happen. It might happen over like 15 generations, but it's not going to happen because you made some policy change. And if you put the policy change in, it'll just fail. So political science, in other words, the science of governing, which is the science of producing commons, we know it, we have it, we've got it. The thing is that it's not a science of everybody does this. It's a science of you engineer what you need given your demographic and your ambitions. Different groups have different needs. Everyone knows I'm pretty fond of, Ghana and Nigeria. I'm pretty fond of those people because they have a lot of promise. But the problem is overcoming the demographic distribution. It's not that their genetic upper middle and middle classes aren't capable, because they go to England, they're fit and fine. They do fine. They come to America, they do fine. That's not going to be true if you bring some Bantu over here with an I-65 IQ or a pygmy with a 55 IQ. They're not going to do well here. You can't have that same government. You can, however, engineer a government for them. It's moral, and it provides means of suppressing the natural criminality that evolves in governments. The whole purpose of that rant was to make the point that this is science. With science, you engineer it. And that means that everybody is capable of using it to produce the government they want with the least negative consequences.
The government they need.
The government they need.
The result that they
Right.
desire. Yeah.
Right. Now, what do you do when that government is Islamic or any fundamentalist, but any fundamentalist government? Well, what you can do is you can enumerate those things in that religion as scientific statements, and you can either cast off or reframe those things that really aren't moral, like, clitoral mutilation or honor killings.
This cities versus states is quite interesting. And I was thinking about this. I think we need to offer terms of surrender. And it's like, I think that was offensive to you in some fashion, because it's not. It's just negotiation of the peace.
Yeah, I think that is an attempt to be cunning rather than truthful. So my view would be truthful is that we're going to have a war.
We're at war. We're at war.
No, that war is going to escalate from institutions from verbal to physical. At that point, it's going to be a lot of dead people. So there's no point in having this. Now, the only peaceful solution that's reciprocal is to undo the abuse of the Civil War and restore the power of the states, and again, prohibit the federal government from doing anything other than adjudicating conflicts between states. Likewise, the federal government, which is now, the primary source of wealth, the DC area is where most of the wealth is created. You would have those people redistributed to states where they would find opportunity and redistribute talent and therefore competitive advantage to states. Of course, the political parasites in Washington and the financial parasites in New York and the cultural parasites in LA will resist. Well, of course they'll resist.
That's what they're doing. So the issue is, in my mind, is to cause the people from the left to understand that there is currently a war, because they don't. They haven't had to adapt. They haven't had to accept the premise that they are waging war on people that don't agree with them. And it's to cause them to come to some knowledge of this in order to cause them to come to the table for the trade.
Why do they have to acknowledge that? Why would they? They're not going to acknowledge that unless you tell them we're at war.
Well, that's what I'm going to tell them.
We're going to escalate this war.
I'm going to tell them it's inevitable that it must be escalated. It looks that way. So it's a rhetorical term. The surrender premise is very rhetorical. It's just a rhetorical term to cause someone to understand something that they didn't understand yesterday. So I talked to the good Americans. You should hear them, man. They love it. They love the premise. It's like, yes, Because once they it's like surrender, it's like that's the last damn thing on their mind, okay? But it's like when they see how it goes with these conditions, it's a negotiation now. It's just a negotiation with an antagonistic player. The purpose of the surrender talk is to cause them to come to an understanding that they didn't have before. It's a slap in the face. It's like, what does that mean?
You're putting them in an unavoidable position of casting them as hostile.
Well, you're hostile. You don't have to agree that you're hostile, but the fact is we regard you as such, and that's the end of the story. If you wish to avoid that reality, well, you'll pay the consequences of it, because we're trying to be nice. We're trying to be polite here and civil. That's the issue. It's like, how do we maintain civility given the circumstances?
I think you should try it. My suspicion is it will at least frame the conversation. You've destroyed our institutions of cultural production. We've succeeded in the destruction of them. Our only choice at this point is to negotiate a settlement, treaty, or to escalate to war.
That's our choice, because it's like the way we've operate is that's the male pattern. It's war or it's civil. And so we need a negotiated truce. That's how we do it. If you want to have the civil solution, you have to agree that you're doing something that we don't like. Even if you think it's legal and ethical and moral and the right thing to do, it doesn't matter because you're transgressing against our interests.
There's enough of us willing to kill you, but this is a bad idea.
The surrender plan with a deadline is sufficient enough for threat. I'm pretty convinced.